Welcome to Social Civics, the channel where we break down the ideas, systems, and institutions that shape our civic life. Today, we're going to tackle a word you hear all the time in the news and in political debates: socialism. It's a term that can get pretty confusing, right? It's often used as a catch-all for a bunch of different ideas. So our goal today is to cut through all that noise and get to what it actually means. So to really get a handle on socialism, we need to start with its most basic, fundamental definition. And you'll see once you grasp this single core idea, all the different versions and debates around it start to make a whole lot more sense.
All right, let's start with that core idea. At its heart, the definition of socialism really just boils down to one central principle, and it's all about ownership.
Okay, here it is. If you take away just one thing from this explainer, let it be this definition. Across the huge variety of socialist ideas out there, the single most common thread is the principle of social ownership of the means of production. So, instead of private individuals or corporations owning the things that create wealth for society, the idea is that society as a whole would own them. So, what in the world are these means of production? I know it sounds a little technical, but it's actually pretty simple. It just means all the non-human stuff we need to produce goods and services. Think about the big picture things: factories, large farms, heavy machinery, mines, that kind of thing. This is not about your personal property. You know, your toothbrush, your car, or your house. The focus is really on the major productive assets that a whole society relies on. So now that we know what socialism proposes, that idea of social ownership, let's dig into the why. What are the underlying goals and values that are really driving this idea? So, what problems are socialists trying to solve with this big idea of social ownership? Well, it generally comes down to three main goals: achieving what they call economic democracy, creating a more equal society, and encouraging cooperation instead of just constant competition. Let's zoom in on that first one, because it's probably the most important. This quote gets right to the heart of the socialist argument for economic democracy. The thinking pretty much goes like this. In a political democracy, citizens get a say in the laws that govern them, right? So socialists ask, why shouldn't that exact same principle apply to the economy? Shouldn't people also have some kind of say in the major economic decisions that shape their entire lives? Now, this is a great way to make that abstract idea feel more real. This analogy just illustrates the point perfectly. I mean, think about it. You could have rented a place for decades, you've made it your home, but because you don't actually own it, you have zero decision-making power. A huge decision that completely upends your life is made without any of your input. Socialists just apply that same logic to something like a factory or a big company, arguing that the people who work there and the community around it should have a voice in its future.
And this brings us to a really crucial point. There is no single blueprint for socialism. How you would actually achieve social ownership is something socialists themselves have been debating for centuries. So let's look at two majorly different approaches they've come up with.
So on one hand, you have the idea of central planning. In this model, a central government authority would basically direct the entire economy, deciding what gets produced and where it all goes. But on the other hand, you have something called market socialism. This version actually keeps parts of a market economy, like competition and prices, but the businesses themselves would be owned by the public or maybe by the workers directly, through things like cooperatives. So where did all of this thinking come from anyway? Well, modern socialism didn't just appear out of thin air. It has a long history that actually grew out of a very specific set of circumstances.
The story of modern socialism really gets started in the early 1800s, mostly as a reaction to the pretty harsh working conditions of the Industrial Revolution. Early thinkers, who are sometimes called utopian socialists, started experimenting with creating more cooperative communities. Then the idea got a huge jolt in 1848 with the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. By the late 1800s, you started to see socialist political parties forming all across Europe. And then, of course, in the 20th century, we saw the rise of state-controlled economies in places like the Soviet Union, which, for a lot of people, became the defining image of what socialism looked like in practice.
Okay, let's jump to today and see how this all connects. Because the modern conversation about socialism often involves a really common point of confusion that's definitely worth clearing up. You hear this all the time, don't you? People will point to Nordic countries like Denmark or Sweden as examples of modern socialism. But is that actually accurate? Let's break down the difference.
This chart does a brilliant job of showing the key distinction. Remember, in a socialist system, the core principle is social ownership of the means of production. But in social democracies, like the ones in Scandinavia, the economy is still fundamentally capitalist. You still have private companies, private ownership, and markets. The big difference is that they have very strong social safety nets, things like universal healthcare and education, that are all funded by high taxes. So they aren't trying to replace capitalism, they're trying to humanize it. They're a modification of capitalism, not an alternative to it.
Of course, the idea of socialism has faced some powerful critiques over the years. Let's just touch on the main ones. First, there's the economic argument. Critics say that without private ownership and the drive for profit, you lose the engine for innovation and efficiency, and that leads to a stagnant economy. Second, there's the political concern. Concentrating that much economic power in the hands of the state could be a huge threat to individual liberty. And finally, critics will point to history, highlighting that many of the 20th century countries that adopted these state-run economies became authoritarian and ended up suppressing human rights. This quote from the economist F.A. Hayek really captures a key philosophical critique. The argument is that a complex modern economy is just way too vast and dynamic for any central planner or government committee to effectively manage. Hayek and others argue that trying to design an economy from the top down isn't just inefficient, it's ultimately a threat to liberty because it requires overriding the free choices of millions of individuals. So, after all that, what is the main takeaway we should leave with? Let's bring it all back to that one core idea we started with. If you remember nothing else, remember this. The central idea of socialism is about ownership. It proposes a fundamental shift in who owns and controls the major economic resources of a society, moving them from private hands to social or public hands. How that is done, why it's done, and whether it's even a good idea, well, those are the subjects of a huge and ongoing debate.
And that leaves us with this final, really crucial question. This is the fundamental tension that the whole debate between capitalism, socialism, and all the systems in between is constantly trying to solve. And look, there are no easy answers here, but understanding the core principles of each idea is absolutely the first step to being able to engage with the question thoughtfully.
If you found this breakdown helpful and you want to better understand the ideas and institutions that shape our world, consider subscribing to Social Civics. This channel exists to help everyday citizens better understand the systems we all live under. Thanks for watching.